Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. Well, this week, Vladimir Putin did his best to upstage NATO's 75th anniversary summit in Washington by bombing a children's hospital in Kiev, making a new pact with Hungary's Orban, and getting a big hug from India's prime minister, who was looking for cheap Russian oil. All signs of the new and growing alliance that is being formed to challenge the West. As for Canada, well, here's a quote from the Wall Street Journal. They posed the question this way: is Canada a NATO scofflaw? A scofflaw being somebody who flouts a law that's difficult to enforce. The Trudeau government rides free on everyone else's defense dollars. Canada is a member of the G7 group of leading democracies, but why? It isn't leading anything and won't even commit to the minimal requirements of being a NATO member. So, for some thoughts and comments on all of this, we go to an old friend, retired Lieutenant General Andrew Leslie. He is the former commander of the Canadian Army in this country. He joined the political game and served as government whip for Justin Trudeau, left politics, but now, after a lifetime of service in the Canadian military, he seems increasingly concerned about the future of our military. Andrew, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you, Senator. It's a privilege as always.
Great to be here. Why do you think they waited for the 11th hour, literally the last moments of the NATO summit, to make a promise that we would meet our NATO commitment, but not for 8 years? It seems like after all the pressure of the week, they kind of scribbled out something on a napkin. What's your take?
I think your analysis is spot on. I believe that the Trudeau government has dramatically misread not only Washington, but our friends and allies within NATO. They, being the Liberal government, has forgotten that there are predators out there, ruthless, cold-hearted, elderly men who have enormous armies and are now using them to achieve political objectives, territorial gains, or to intimidate their neighbors. So respect for the international rule of law is starting to revert back to one of deterrence. And to be credible against ruthless predators, you have to have a force which is capable of fighting and surviving. Alone, Canada can't do that. And we are a country of relationships, of trade, of defense, of social development, of whatever the issue might be. Right now, we're standing remarkably alone amongst the people who are supposed to be our closest friends and allies. And indeed, they are. And that's NATO.
It was stunning to me, actually, to watch the Prime Minister's press conference. He was angry and dismissive. He described the 2% basic commitment that all members make to keep their NATO membership as arbitrary, an accounting process, a crass calculation, and went on to say our approach to defense is profoundly serious, yet his remarks focused on climate change when we're dealing with 2 live wars, civil wars, genocides, and these new alliances that are forming with Russia and China at the helm. It just seemed so disconnected from reality.
Fully agreed. It's very dangerous for heads of government to go to international meetings of other heads of government and be ill-prepared or dismissive of promises to which you have committed. Now, let's just review history. 2014, that's when the pledge was first established. And this prime minister recommitted in 2016, in 2017, with the release of the then defense policy Strong, Secure, Engaged, which, by the way, promised the sun, the moon, and the stars and achieved almost nothing. It certainly did not contribute one single piece of modern advanced combat capability to the armed forces' desperate need of trying to modernize. Just that. And now here we are. He's recommitted, let's not forget, to the 2% in 2019, in 2021, in 2022, 2023, and now we're in 24. He comes down to the Washington site And he is literally bombarded by critics, powerful critics, not only American, but across the spectrum of friends
Yeah.
and allies. And I think he's now scrambling and throwing darts at a dartboard.
So, and to kind of add injury to insult, and then he says by 2032, 8 years from now, when clearly he will no longer be in government.
Well, by 2032, we still don't have any clear plan to get to anywhere close to 2%.
Yeah.
Because the defense policy update of just a couple of months ago, let's not forget, was very, very vague on details. And as a matter of fact, and NATO nations know this, for those who are watching your podcast, and I hope a lot of people do, the Canadian Armed Forces in 2024 will be receiving less cash than in 2023. And on top of that, we've got the Freeland imposed cuts for quota efficiency, which are almost $850 million additional dollars. And that's still going forward. NATO is worried about right now, not necessarily what's going to happen 10, 20, 30 years.
Exactly. Right now, when these things are live, just I think a rough calculation, $18 billion a year increase in spending just to meet that floor of 2%. No indication of where that might come from. I don't know how many more taxes you can impose to raise $18 billion a year just to meet the entry fee.
Well, this is the government that has cheerfully spent hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in deficit spending. In other words, they've gone over the limit of what they actually have in the piggy bank. And it's a question of prioritization. So at what cost do we increase defense spending? Let's get back to the Prime Minister's comment that he believes that 2% is arbitrary. Of course it is. It's an arbitrary number designed to give a goal and objective to which nations can be held accountable. But of all the arbitrary measures out there, this was best deemed to be the one that most people could rally around.
Right.
And let's not forget, Canada agreed. This Prime Minister agreed to it. He promised that he would do it. And here we are. His promise is now being called out.
So if we look at the statements that were made, I think 88 fighter jets, 12 subs, and in a new partnership called the Ice Pact, we try and build 3 icebreakers. Just given how we have to acquire that equipment, even those promises, would that actually increase us closer to 2%? Because with some of these things, it's not clear that the expenditures would count, even if we did them.
Now, to be fair and balanced, over the last 2 years, the Liberal government has made a large number of promises about buying much needed defense capability, but it's all being introduced years from now.
Right.
So we have to start from the beginning, which is why did it take so long? 8 years, 9 years to get to the point where we're actually starting to spend on defense capability, which will help our friends and allies and on which we rely, because if we don't help defend them, they won't help to defend us. Aha, the critics will say. We have no threat because the Americans are always there to protect us. Yet the Americans are the ones who are criticizing us the most, and quite rightly, because they have a feeling that we've been riding on their coattails. How do we know this? Because they've said it publicly.
It's not just the fear of Donald Trump, who has said, look, I'm not going to defend you guys if you don't pay. He didn't say it just to us. It was a more general statement. But it's both Republicans and Democrats that are calling us out now. This is almost a nonpartisan thing.
Without meaning to sound derogatory towards my close American friends and colleagues who are part of the political and military system down in the United States, it takes an awful lot to bring Republicans and Democrats together. And certain issues do unify them, however. The first amongst those is defense and security of the United States, and then defense and security of their friends and allies. And they take that responsibility very seriously. And they have formed largely the accurate perception that Canada and this Prime Minister and his cabinet do not take defense seriously. And how do we know this? Because they're saying so. And recently, almost half the Senate got together. Well, actually, a third of the Senate got together, crossed party lines, and wrote a scathing publicly delivered message saying,
Yep.
pony up because you're not meeting your promises.
No, it was stunning. I just was looking here at Bill Blair's comments. This was at a meeting, I think, around April or May, and he was talking to this very issue, and he said, trying to go to cabinet or even to Canadians and tell them we had to do this because we need to meet this magical threshold of 2%. Don't get me wrong, it's important, but it was really hard to convince people that it was a worthy goal, that it was somehow some noble standard that we had to meet.
It's a promise.
Do you think that's what it's like around the cabinet table, that they're just saying, who cares? We don't need to do this. Climate's our issue. That's what our particular voters care about. So we're not going to do this. We'll let somebody else.
When I first entered politics and became a member of the now Liberal government, it was made clear to me that there would be significant investments in new defense capability. And a new policy was released in 2017, Strong, Secure, Engaged, to which I've already referred. It also became very clear by around 2018, 2019, that the government had no intention of actually following through on any of the over 100 promises of new equipments and capabilities and new infrastructure for the troops. And they didn't do any of that. So what has changed? Well, the world has changed. And it's not only climate change. In the course of the same 4 days, you had the Prime Minister say our number one objective, our security risk to everything that we do is climate change. Got it. Meanwhile, you've got Minister Blair saying our number one priority is the risk posed by China. Got it. Then you've got the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada saying the number one priority is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Got it. But of course, first of all, there's obvious they're really not talking about this a lot. Secondly, in one sense, they're all correct, because it's those things plus the ongoing tragedy of variety of catastrophic events in the Middle East. It's the impact of the food crisis in Africa, of drought, of the disruption of supply chains, very fragile supply chains, wherein Ukraine used to be the breadbasket of essentially Africa with exports and also potash for crop enhancement. All that combined with uncertainty and disrespect for the rule of law climbing just about everywhere you care to look. And not only that, but you have essentially voters in a desire for change. Oh, it's a deadly combination. And what the Liberal government has not realized is actually moving beyond the words of saying the world has changed and doing something about it. The world has changed. It's much more dangerous than it used to be. Right. And what we as Canada have to do is we have to grit our teeth. We have to have national leadership which can articulate why we want to buy ships, warships, why we want to buy fighter jets, why we want to buy surveillance and acquisition systems for our pristine north, because there are threats out there, and now explain them to people. And Canadians will listen, as they have in the past.
This is the thing about the Arctic in particular. We run around beating our chests, claiming that it's ours. We don't have anything that could protect that. The Russians invade our airspace every day, and the Chinese are there, and they're building, I don't know, I think Russia has 40 icebreakers, and you know, we've got rhetoric.
We do. Rhetoric and also facts on which to base a discussion. So for about 20 years, Russia and China, who, by the way, do not recognize a significant portion of Canada's claim to the Arctic, have had a court case in front of the United Nations saying just that. Do I expect Russia or Ukraine to invade our north? No, I don't. But I certainly would anticipate seeing over the next little while some mining platforms or some fishing vessels starting to challenge what we take as our territorial waters. That's not an act of war. But if you have no deterrence inherent in your own nation, that means you've got to go to someone else to ask for help. Okay, but the United States is busy. Plus, they're tired of shouldering the burden alone. They're willing to do it, but they're tired of shouldering the burden alone. They've asked their friends and allies to commit to 2%, and Canada has agreed. Now it's disingenuous, quite frankly, to now say, well, it's an arbitrary number. Of course it is, and it was explained as such. But in the absence of any other sort of coherent mechanism to try and measure progress, it's what we got. And we promised and repromised and repromised on the repromise, and it goes on.
I want to come back to some specifics on Ukraine because there was Zelensky again at the meeting asking people to free him up to try and win. But in this more general approach where we have the prime minister's, as I say, sort of dismissive view of NATO. And always, and Minister Joly jumped in again to do the whole contrast between hard power and soft power, that we don't need guns and bullets. We're the people that do, bread and butter. We're the nice guys that go in and help you. Somebody else can do the boots on the ground, and we'll do the social diplomacy. My own experience with this is very limited, so I want to ask you about it too. I remember sitting in Afghanistan and sitting around with women and the community leaders, and we would be talking about what the priorities were, and that, we needed women's groups to meet on Tuesday, and that should be a really important part of building their democracy, and all these wonderful ideas that seem really sensible in the West. And they looked at us like we had three heads and said, we're fighting for our lives. We're just trying to stay alive. We're just trying to feed people. We're just trying to keep and get our girls educated and keep these bad guys at bay. Like, this soft power stuff sometimes just doesn't translate in any real way.
Well, first of all, Senator, thank you for being one of the few, actually, from the global community who actually went way out there and met with village communities in a tough place called Afghanistan while there was a war raging all around. So let's use that as an example. Hard power provides the foundation around which soft power can be allowed to spread its wings and fly. And for us to arbitrarily choose to ignore the hard power requirements in a coalition context means that we're going to run into circumstances and situations where someone else, a predator like Russia or the emerging predator China, is going to get into disputes with us because we are not strong. The critics will say, well, that's irresponsible, that's old thinking, you're a bunch of dinosaurs. Got it. But look at Ukraine. Look what could happen to Taiwan. Look at the activities of China in a variety of regions in the Indo-Pacific. Look at other would-be dictators or actual dictators who are using military force not as the tool of last resort, but as their first choice, especially against those who are defenseless. Let's get back to the Arctic. Our Arctic now is currently undefended. Yep. The United States has a much smaller Arctic, and they have 21,000 men and women with all sorts of combat equipment, air, land, sea, space, deployed to Alaska. Russia has about 35,000 troops still in their Arctic, which they have not yet deployed to Ukraine because why? They have not dozens, but multiple dozens and dozens, indeed perhaps even close to 100 of vessels that are stationed along the Arctic archipelago. What does Canada have permanently deployed up north? Nothing. We have about 300 people, great people. Yep. A lot of them are rangers. Most of them are full-time or part-time administrative. We have no full-time deterrent capability up there. Now we rely on who to do that for us? The Americans.
Yeah. I went to Alert, to our northernmost point, and it's a fascinating place to be, but that is a pretty small outpost with both China and Russia facing us from the north.
And there's no combat capability in it.
Nope.
No. So here we are.
Okay, I want to come back to just Ukraine specifically for a moment, if we could. A lot of talk this week about the bridge to NATO membership for Ukraine. This is, of course, what inspired Putin in the first place, this notion of Article 5, that, if you attack one, you attack us all. And then if we put Ukraine in there, that would be a problem. So he just struck while the striking was good, and he saw that we hadn't resisted on Crimea or other places. So and some movement now from the Brits and I think the Netherlands to say to Ukraine, you can use our equipment to go deeper into Russian territory. I want to come back to where we are. I think we announced plans in 2023 to donate a multi-million dollar surface to air missile defense system. Where is it? Does it exist? It certainly isn't in Ukraine.
No, it's not in Ukraine. And it's gone the way of the vast majority of Canadian defense acquisition efforts. Nothing's happening. Now, to be fair, that was a multinational system. The main purchaser is coming from the United States, and I
Yeah.
believe it's under another country's license in terms of the actual technology. So it's inevitable whenever you get multinational organizations trying to buy the same weapon systems to do the same thing for third-party clients, in this case, the Ukraine, there's some confusion and chaos. But considering the perils that Ukraine faces and the tragedies that are ensuing because they don't have anti-aircraft systems, the aircraft are getting through, so are the missiles, so are the drones, and people are dying. So it doesn't really matter.
Hospitals are being blown up. Yeah.
Yeah, we got to get more capability in the hands of Ukraine to carry on the fight. Really, they're fighting for all of us because they're blunting the assault of the Russian bear.
With the movement by the Brits and Netherlands, do you think the US is going to do the same to free up the Ukrainians to allow them to use American equipment to cross the border?
I believe it's already starting to happen.
Okay.
I believe that more advanced systems are en route. This is a make or break 12 to 18 months for Ukraine. Russia has been slowly grinding its way forward, essentially losing tens of thousands of their men and women each month. But they don't care. They don't appear to, as Ukraine cares very deeply, and they're fighting a valiant battle with brilliant generalship. And they're literally inventing new technologies with which to try and defeat the Russians as they attack. But inevitably, Russia is trying to bleed them dry, which is the Soviet and old Russian approach to warfare reincarnated. It's amazing. Here we are in 2024. We've got drones and we've got long-range missiles that can strike essentially a house from 300 kilometers away, right, and trench warfare surrounded by barbed wire with anti-tank ditches and massive equipment's rumbling around because it can take a hit, such as tanks. And here we are again on, massive warfare on the European plain, right on literally Europe's doorstep.
This is kind of the interesting thing about the use of some of the technology, that it stalled both sides in a way, because you can't move your tank, it can be hit. You can't, move your soldiers or they're going to be hit. But as you say, Russia doesn't care. They use their people as fodder and just send them in. I mean, nobody knows what the real number is of casualties, of losses, but it's huge. But Ukraine's a much smaller place, and they're running out of people, literally, of the right age and the right talent to be able to do this.
They are. And they're trying their best. They've lowered the age at which people will be sent to the front, whether they want to or not. But they're still drawing on a vast pool of very experienced people, some of whom, let's not forget, have been fighting since 2014 against the Russians.
Yeah.
So think about that. That's 10 years of combat. The duration of the Second World War was 6.5 to 7 years, depending on where you're from. And usually at the end of 12 to 18 months of fighting, you're exhausted. And a bunch of those very tough men and women have been doing this for 10 years.
I mean, we've got Ukrainians in my local community here in Saskatchewan. The women are here. Some men who were, too old or were injured, but they are losing people at home, sons and brothers and husbands, pretty regularly.
Now, this isn't because Ukraine wasn't prepared.
Exactly.
Putin struck. By the way, there is an article, there's just a couple of sentences. I mean, generals in NATO are forced to study the NATO founding documents, of course. And if you're at war, you can't technically join NATO.
Yeah.
So there's something in there in terms of the documentation which says that for Ukraine and its desire to join NATO, I believe it would require unanimous consent of all NATO members to change that, which would be quite tough with Hungary and a couple of other
Yeah.
outliers willing to sort of veto anything that favors Ukraine. Getting back to the issue of the Ukraine and the Ukraine war, I've yet to see signs of instability or chaos surrounding Putin and his gang of oligarchs and thugs.
Right.
So they are not going to stop. And the question to ask is, how does this end? And there's 2 to 3 big scenarios. One, Russia wins. The odds are high they won't stop. Why?
Yeah.
Because Putin has told us for 22 years he's not going to stop.
Yeah.
Just like he told us for 22 years he was going to invade Ukraine.
Yeah.
If Russia loses, what does that look like? It will certainly mean we have a vengeful and angry Russian bear armed with a whole host of weapons, with most of their stupid generals and soldiers being dead. So they've learned over the last 3 to 4 years through their combat in Ukraine how to move better, faster, smarter than most other armies. And what instability will spread then from Russia's borders to other venues of opportunity for the gang that might end up running Russia?
Well, and it's, again, not just Russia. As we see the BRICS expanding and the relationship between India and Russia, the relationship between China and Russia, the, other places, Hungary, this is starting to be a big counter alliance to the West. And these folks have money and people and armaments and ideas and plans.
They do. And let's get back to the issue of soft power versus hard power. And they claim that Canada doesn't do hard power, which is nonsense. We had 1 million men and women in combat in the Second World War out of a population of just over 11 million. So it's an astonishing number. And we've shown that we have the combat capability and the willingness to do so when the cause is right by our combat activities, Korea and in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So let's just talk about what's happening internationally with the alliance, essentially, of the East versus the West. Does this sound familiar? The difference now is people didn't think through the impact of sanctions. They thought that the soft power approach would be sufficient. Russia would be driven to its knees because we cut off trade or put a variety of sanctions on their oligarchs or whatever the issue might be. It had the exact reverse effect. Right now, the bonds between Russia and China are stronger and getting even stronger with every passing month. The same is true of North Korea and the other nations that you mentioned. China's largest trading partner is Iran now. Its second largest trading partner is Russia. Russia's getting drones and technicians and perhaps even people from Iran. What are they giving in return? We're not sure. China, of course, is playing Russia and the West, all with an intent really to expand their reach and their aggressive sort of territorial ambitions.
As we're watching in Africa and other places.
Yeah. Africa, South America, even the Caribbean. So we have to actually pause our current thinking and not be delusional in terms of ignoring the threats. And they're out there. So let's admit they're out there and try to do something about it. And in certain cases, yes, diplomacy can work. And that's the aim of the soldiers on the ground, to fight the good fight to allow a political settlement to be realized. Got it. And that's negotiated by the diplomats.
Right.
But they go together. And have only hard is illogical. Having only soft is illogical.
It's the old peace through strength argument that they only come to the table and listen if you've got something to back up your tough words, right?
Right.
A comment or two about NATO itself. You're saying each of the countries need a rethink, but maybe NATO does too, in terms of who's at the table. 32 countries now. As you say, it'll be a while for Ukraine because they can't be at war. So that, that's a long road. What did you see over the last 2 or 3 days? Some tough words about China came out, obviously, talking to member countries saying you've got to beef up your own state of readiness at home for attacks on your ports and airports and borders. So get smarter about that. Is there a shakeup that still needs to happen there?
Well, there's one or two member states that are really not playing ball with the rest of NATO. Of course, Canada is one of those in terms of its percentage of GDP towards armaments. We've already talked about that.
Yeah.
Perhaps another interesting example is that of Hungary, where you've got a leader who is essentially more attracted, if I can use that term, towards Russia and China than he is to his Western colleagues. But that too may pass when they have their next general elections. Right now, I think they can live with that situation. They can manage the friction through diplomacy, but also through some hard pressure tactics in terms of trade and the linkages. But I can see NATO expanding. I can see NATO amending its founding charter. And right now, there's a geographic bubble, which is explained in the NATO founding documents. But I can see that being amended to include like-minded allies and friends, such as Australia, New Zealand, and perhaps the list goes on.
Yeah.
So I don't think NATO is going away because it's an alliance and a coalition of the willing, but they're also integrated in terms of trade, which is ever more important. Exactly. Supply lines and trade exchanges starts to dry up with those who support essentially the Russia, China, Iran, anyways.
Yeah. I mean, that's the other thing. When you say that, it just twigs me again. When we're not meeting our minimum requirement promises we made, our government made, you can expect that some of that might be raised at, I don't know, the renegotiation of the NAFTA 2 agreement, for example. Like these things aren't disconnected or unconnected. They're very much part of a bargaining strategy. I want to come back to you for a moment because you have looked at this literally from the ground, from a position of leadership, commander and of the army, but also other leadership positions in the military. You are you've seen it from the government side, from being inside the government process. And I shared the words of Bill Blair there about sometimes a sense of indifference about this. We have money in our defense system. It's been promised, but we can't seem to spend it because of this rather bizarre procurement process. I don't even know if you want to try and explain it, but you have to spend the money in a year, you have to give it back. Well, you don't buy an F-35 in 1 year. You don't buy or build a piece of equipment in 1 year. If you could wave your magic wand, what would you try and fix about making that process work?
Well, I don't necessarily have to wave a magic wand. I'll refer us back to shortly before you came and joined us in Afghanistan and risked your life to get out there and talk to some villagers under some very interesting circumstances. Once again, very well done.
You.
So I was the Army commander in 2006, as you know, and I had the honor of serving under 3 different prime ministers, either as a 1, 2, or 3-star general, most of which was focused on Afghanistan. And the first one of those was essentially Prime Minister Chrétien.
Yep.
When I first deployed to Afghanistan with a couple of thousand friends in 2003, he promised us a whole bunch of equipment, and we got it. We got radars, we got guns, we got new weapon systems, and the list goes on, all quickly achieved within months. Why? Because the prime minister was involved, and so was the minister of finance, who then became the prime minister. And Prime Minister Martin kept the increases that Chrétien allocated and then gave us even more. And he would call his people and say, why doesn't the army have the stuff that they're asking for? Because I read in the media that, and bingo, it would arrive. We had a prime minister and a minister of finance who were personally involved. Yeah. Then we got into Prime Minister Harper. And we had a prime minister and Jim Flaherty, a finance minister, who were not only personally involved, but would actually end up calling a whole bunch of subordinate people saying, why doesn't the armed forces have the stuff that they say they need? I don't understand the delay. Make sure it's solved within a couple hours. The system will work as fast as the government wants it to.
That's exactly right. We came back from Afghanistan after the end of our trips. We went in, we briefed the prime minister and said what we need is airlift. Our young men and women are getting killed on the roads. They're being blown up by IEDs. We don't have them in the proper equipment, not to mention the fact that they were in green fatigues, not desert fatigues. But he went and rented some planes and helicopters and got them in there. So that's the trick.
The trick is to get leadership at the various highest levels to break through the institutional logjams which grow up if you're thinking of nothing but soft power. And that's where we are now as a result of this soft power mentality where, you know what? Spending on defense is our very last priority and it's an afterthought because deep down the Americans are going to protect us. Yeah. Well, they've actually said they're tired of that. Yeah. And at least one of the potential presidents has made some very specific indications that if he's elected, then there will be a physical and trade price to pay. And of course, you've brought up NAFTA. It was my privilege to be somewhat involved in the renegotiations. Yeah. My role was to focus on the governors. I think I visited 33. Usually within the first sentence and a half, they thank you for my service in Afghanistan. And then they'd say defense and security. These are state governors.
Yeah. Yeah.
They are focused on defense and security. They understand it. All this is reported back. That's why I'm dismayed that the Liberal government has misread the tone in Washington. They've misread essentially what our NATO allies are asking of us to do, essentially, which is what we promised. So fast forward to now. How do we solve this? Put people in there who can actually get hard stuff done. No excuses, no delay, no provocation. Why? Because troops' lives are on the line. We have an organization, a military organization in Latvia, which is not well equipped. Right. Doesn't have the sophisticated technologies to protect them from a variety of threats. I won't go into specifics. We could do a lot better. And we've done better in the past.
I know.
We don't have the money. We don't have the money, they'll say. Sure we do. You spent hundreds of billions of dollars over the last couple of years.
Well, and when you think of what we throw away on a daily basis on stuff we bought for COVID that we then turn to the scrap heap, but I mean, I know a young soldier here who, went to Latvia on a tour and mom and dad bought the helmet so that he wasn't wearing a pie plate on his head. Like, this is just, it's 2024. This seems absurd.
Well, here's another fact, Senator. Generals can't buy anything in the Canadian Armed Forces. You can't buy a box of pencils. It all goes through a public service driven, minimal risk approach, which is code for zero risk, which ends up producing almost nothing. Oh, they're good at buying the small stuff, but the big stuff that can go bang and hurt people, weapon systems, they're awful. They're amongst the very worst, not only in NATO, but in the world.
And but do you really even want, Andrew, the person that's buying staplers and paper clips making decisions about air defense systems? Like, no, we need some specialized decision
and it's also compounded with a lack of a sense of urgency.
Yeah.
Much akin to the current government's response to the demand to get up to 2%. They're now saying 2032. Well, okay, but don't forget that the original goal was 2024, which is right here.
Oh, yeah, right
and
now.
NATO financial experts will say in the same breath, and by the way, you said you'd be at 2%. Yet in 2024, the Canadian Armed Forces is getting less money than they got in 2023.
Yeah. One quick final comment. You've been so generous with your time here, just on recruitment. I don't know, you probably know the number better than I do, but the last one I heard is we're 16,000 people shy because we can't recruit people because of the mixed messages about what the mission really is, what they're being asked to do. When you sign up for the military, you don't think you're going to work in an old folks' home. You think that you're going to serve your country in a different way. And then we have all these other requirements with the diversity priorities, et cetera. How do we resolve this? I mean, 16,000 people, if that number is accurate, this is very, very troubling.
Well, it's one of the paramount issues that will be facing the new Chief of Defense Staff as she settles into her assumption of command. And their numbers are bang on. They're about 16,000. There are always solutions. The problem perhaps today is you have a system which has been under stress for years. You've got the middle rankers, so the ones who actually get a lot of stuff done. That's the sergeant majors, the warrant officers, the captains, the majors, who are leaving after 20 years because they don't see any new equipment. They don't really see any future, and they're not getting the signs of love from the government in terms of money and ability to spend it. All gets back to that issue. But on top of that, surprisingly, and not a lot of people know this, we have multiple tens of thousands of people who want to join the armed forces, but they're caught in process. Yeah. And these are exemplary young Canadians who I'd be very proud to have in my army back in 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7, whenever. But they can't blow through, not their term to use, they can't sort of broach those barriers of ironclad rules about what sort of medication you can be on, what your physical fitness is. And as a result, the bureaucracy is centralizing even more. By the way, the Canadian Forces and D&D bureaucracy has grown by 30 to 40% in the last 8 months. Oops.
But we can't get the recruits in because it takes a year and a half to do the paperwork.
So flip the paradigm, much akin to the way it was perhaps 15, 16, 18 years ago. Instead of having it highly centralized, decentralize it. Turn around to the head of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and to the reserve units out there and say, you know what, you go out, here are the criteria. You go find the recruits. You bring them in, you keep them. We'll find the money. It can be that simple. Yeah. It's easy to say, but I've seen it work. There's a whole bunch of people who still remember how to get that done. Yeah. And if you approach it with the attitude, listen, subordinate commanders, you're not listening to me. I'm telling you, this power is now delegated to you, the service chiefs, regular and reserve. Go find the troops. We'll sort out the training when it's required, but I expect you to do most of it yourselves, and we'll find you the money. And it's not like they don't have the money because they're handing money back in. Yeah,
they're handing money back in. I remember sitting in a meeting with Stanley McChrystal, who was running the operation in Iraq and Afghanistan for the Americans, who, with our small numbers and our lack of equipment and the wrong uniforms and you name the whole list, he just said, it's amazing to watch your men and women work. They so punch above their weight, but governments don't get to ride on the backs or free ride on the backs of those young men and women who are really putting it all on the line because they've got no choice, and if they don't have the equipment, they try and figure out something. Fortunately, a lot of them come from farms, so they know how to make stuff happen. But you hear someone like that say, it's unbelievable what you've got. And then you watch our own government not have their backs when others can even recognize the level of talent and commitment.
I would argue that over the last decade and a half, even 2 to 3 decades, political leaders could get away with only doing that which was absolutely required for defense. And when there was blood being shed, that attracted more attention, of course. Right. We have a very positive example of how Ottawa and the procurement system responds to strong political leadership from the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance if they're focused on defense. We've also seen the reverse, what happens when they're not.
Yeah.
The world has changed. The predators are on the prowl. We need to do better for our friends and allies. We know we have the resources because they're there. The government is forcing DND and the Canadian Armed Forces to hand back not hundreds of millions, but billions each year. 3.2 billion over the last 2 years. Money that was promised under Strong, Secure, Engaged. And it wasn't spent.
Retired Lieutenant General Andrew Leslie, former commander of the Canadian Army, a lifetime of service for which we thank you. And we thank you for continuing to make the case and helping all of us understand what looks from the outside to be a strange system. And what you do is explain to us how and why it is. And I think we need leadership to stand up. Thanks, Andy, so much. It's always great to talk with you.
Likewise, Senator. Thank you. Always a privilege.
Great. That is it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. And next week, we'll talk a little bit more about this. Our guest is the outgoing head of the Defense Force, Wayne Eyre. He happens to be a good local Saskatchewan boy from my hometown, so I've known him for a long time, and we're going to carry on this conversation about the state of the Canadian military and the state of the world in which we find ourselves. So thank you, Andy, and we look forward to the conversation with Wayne Eyre, and we'll see all of you again very soon. Thanks.
Thank you.